Hello, I'm Dr. Caroline Heldman, the Executive Director of the Representation Project. The Representation Project is an organization that uses impact films and education to challenge damaging gender norms and stereotypes in the US. And I am excited to launch our new interview series as part of our End Rape campaign. The End Rape campaign is an effort to raise awareness about the causes and consequences of sexual violence. Please visit our website, www.therepproject.org, for resources and information that you can share with friends and family who want to know more about how to prevent sexual violence. This is the first interview in our expert interview series, and I want to just put up a trigger warning, or what we call now an activation warning, that we will be discussing issues of sexual violence. So if you are a survivor of sexual violence or a trauma survivor who may be activated by content regarding sexual violence, perhaps you want to watch this and skip over certain sections, or not watch this interview altogether, given the content. I am honored to kick off this series on sexual violence prevention with the one, the only Angela Rose. This is a really long bio because this is a human being who has done so much good in the world that her bio is long and deserved. Angela is the founder of PAVE. PAVE is an organization called Promoting Awareness and Victim Empowerment. It is the leading anti-sexual violence organization in the United States. And Angela's innovative work on the issue of sexual violence has made her a highly respected, engaging speaker and expert on sexual assault and violence prevention. At the age of 17, Angela was abducted at knife point outside a suburban Chicago shopping mall. She was assaulted by a repeat sex offender who was on parole for murder. After suffering at the hands of her abductor, she then suffered at the hands of authorities who, instead of helping her, subjected her to scrutiny, to blame, and to additional victimization. The anguish of her abduction was immediately magnified by anger and a strong sense of injustice at her treatment by authorities. Angela turned her anger into a positive force for change, and she worked with her attackers' previous victims and others concerned about sexual violence in their community to help pass Illinois' Sexually Dangerous Persons Commitment Act in 1998. In 2001, she founded PAVE, and this organization creates education and action surrounding issues of sexual violence. Today, PAVE has chapters in many states. They train fraternities and sororities on sexual assault prevention, and they convene the National Campus Sexual Assault Summit held at Georgetown Law that was broadcasted live to over 300 colleges. Angela's work on college campuses led to an invitation to the White House for the launch of the It's On Us campaign, and she was asked to serve on the White House Task Force to protect students from sexual assault, which was chaired by then Vice President Joe Biden. Angela's passion for ending sexual violence through prevention, education, and empowerment has led to several major projects and speaking engagements, including the documentary, which you must see, Transition to Survivor, also the founding of Men Opposing Sexual Assault. She has run and organized and created many trainings for professional law enforcement groups and the American Psychological Association and several branches of the U.S. military. Angela presents annually at the International Conference on Violence, Abuse, and Trauma, and she personally works with thousands of rape survivors. She's worked with rape survivors from Uganda. She was invited by the former First Lady of France to participate in the Women's Global Dialogue for Action. Angela's incredible efforts have been profiled by the Oprah Winfrey Network, by the Bio Channel, the Today Show, Time Magazine, Cosmo Girl, Girls Life Magazine, and CNN Headline News profiled her on their Breakthrough Women series. Angela, in addition to everything else she has done, is also an author. She authored the book Hope, Healing, and Happiness, Going Inward to Transform Your Life. She has been awarded accolades for doing her work, including the 40 Under 40 by her alma mater, the University of Madison, Wisconsin. She was also given the Inspiration Award from today's Chicago Woman magazine and the Promise Award from the YWCA. And I should say that Angela and I met at the Cosby trial, where she was providing survivor advocacy to Andrea Constan, who is the only survivor of Bill Cosby who's within the statute of limitations out of 63 public survivors and many more who were not public. And Angela provided exceptional support and care for Dre during that trial. She is a courageous survivor advocate, and I am just honored to introduce her. Welcome, Angela Rose.
What I love about PAVE's model is that we really like to train students on that peer education model. So there's actually now a class called PAVE through the School of Social Work where students get class credit to become peer educators. And so we kind of took that model and looked at that. How do we really launch that nationwide? How do you create something and be able to scale it? And so we created a little how-to guide, how to start a PAVE chapter in your college campus. And what we realized is that there was such a need. It was, and we take a positive approach. I think that's the other kind of unique selling proposition of PAVE is, these topics are tough. Nobody wants to talk about these issues, but if you gauge it in a way that's positive and proactive, I find that more people want to be involved to be a part of the solution, if that makes sense. So I think the language and the way that you couch it is really important. That we are for consent and for healthy relationships instead of being anti-sexual violence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So you're getting around maybe some of the defenses of folks who need to hear your message, but otherwise wouldn't if it were framed in a more negative way or a more accusatory way. It's an incredible model, and a lot of folks have copied your model, I will say. We are certainly doing that with our peer-to-peer work, so thank you for that. So going back to your experience, you noted that your we can talk a bit about rape myths in a bit, but you noted that your experience was somewhat unique in that it was a stranger, and that you got a lot of support for that, and that you're really serving folks. Most of the people you're talking to, most of the people I'm talking to, it's people they know. It's people they know and trust. In fact, or trusted. And you, let's talk a little bit about your experience, which was pretty standard when you went to law enforcement, even though this was a stranger, right? You go to law enforcement. What was that process like? And what is it typically like for survivors in your experience?
Well, I think it's so important that we realize that sexual assault is the most underreported crime, and delayed disclosure is absolutely normal for many, many survivors. I did disclose right away, but it's also because there was a weapon involved. In my case, there was a kidnapping where most of the time there is no weapon used. So I think it's important for us to differentiate that people have this idea, I think, or at least they did pre Me Too, of like what is sexual violence, and they think it's with a weapon. And most of the time there is no weapon used, but there was in my case. And so when I kind of found myself in a like almost like this out of body experience. We've heard that from a lot of survivors. It's this beautiful way that your brain dissociates in order to keep you safe. And so I almost felt like throughout the process that I felt like I was almost looking down on myself until that moment where I was kind of thrown into a stairwell and the perpetrator told me to, stay there and count to 100. But I tried to take the bindings off my hands and my wrists and my eyes to try and catch the license plate, but he was too quick and drove away. And so all of that moment in that stairwell, sort of everything just hit me. And my idea was that I was going to call mall security to drive me back to my car so I could drive home in my safe place from my house and call the police. But when I walked down the stairwell, the man working at the auto shop, his face just fell back. Being 17, being under 18, I should have probably gone to a children's advocacy center, which is a beautiful center that many communities have where people that are teenagers or children only tell the story one time with like a one-way mirror where the interview is recorded. Because as we all know, for anyone who's been through trauma, having to relive it multiple times is very difficult. And so when I told the same story to all these police officers, when I waited for the detective for so many hours, I was just amazed at his body language. And we do a lot of law enforcement training. And so sometimes you don't even have to say anything. It's just the body language. So he came in with his arms closed, very dismissive. And after I told him the story of what happened to me, he said, "Well, I need to ask you a question that I ask every victim that comes in here. Are you lying?" I said, "No, of course not. Are you in an abusive relationship, Angela? Does your boyfriend hit you? Because, sometimes girls get themselves in a situation." And nothing was done on my case that night. They didn't take evidence, they didn't take clothes. Where he had bound my hands behind my back, where my arms were all lacerated. And when they took the photos to use in court, it was a Polaroid camera, but they were so overexposed they could barely use them in court for evidence. They were so convinced that I had made this up. And I just remember feeling just infuriated. And I think looking back, people do have an idea of what like a sexual assault survivor in their minds, victim slash survivor, should be looking like or acting like. Like I wasn't crying. Had I, of course, I've had my tears since then, healing from this. But I think that there's an idea of what like this quote unquote perfect victim should be. There is no such thing as a perfect victim. No, I wasn't crying that night. I was extremely angry. And, a lot of survivors, sometimes they even have a smile on their face. Sometimes when I talk about my trauma, I have a smile because it's uncomfortable to talk about. So I think that a lot of folks in law enforcement and otherwise, friends and well-meaning loved ones, oftentimes have this idea of what survivors should act and look like. And there is no such thing as, everybody reacts differently to trauma. It's important for people to realize that. So yeah, when finally, thankfully, they put two new detectives on my case a couple of days later, and they were able to catch him. I did a sketch of his face, and they put it all over the Chicago news, and someone recognized him. He's a parole officer. Because not only had he done this before, but he had a laundry list of other crimes, which I told the police that night. I said I knew he had done this before. So, we see a lot of repeat offenders, even on college campuses and high schools. Like, I know Dr. David Lisek does a lot of work talking about repeat sex offenders. So they are in every community. And I think it's important for us to realize that this can impact all of us. Anyone can be impacted by this.
Well, and you're just busting rape myths left and right, right? So you brought up the fact that men can be raped as well, people of all genders. It's 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men is kind of the shorthand. You also challenge the myth that it's a stranger jumping out of the bushes, even though it wasn't your case. That it's typically someone you know. It typically doesn't involve a weapon, that folks don't report right away. It's really common for them to not report right away, even though you did. That there's no proper way to respond to trauma. Uh, Talk to me about what other things you wish people knew about sexual violence.
Well, if I could wave my magic wand, I would remove the shame in every survivor's heart because there is one theme, and I have talked to countless survivors over the last 25 years of doing this work. And I feel like the one thing that just really can inhibit us from our God given destiny is this notion of shame. We just had an event in LA a couple of weeks ago, and we had actor Jonathan Sheck receive an award. He's a male survivor. And he talked about how there's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is that you feel like something that you did was wrong. Shame, he said so beautifully, was that you feel like you are wrong. And he just felt like there was just so many issues with him being a male survivor, and I feel like I have felt that so deeply, and so many survivors that I've spoken to over the years, we've just had this feeling of shame. And I think it's also because even well-meaning loved ones, like I mentioned, oftentimes say very victim blaming things even when they don't want to or don't mean to. Parents, I think it's now that I am a mom, I think there's so much, with parents, we want to protect our kids. And so it's very easy for us to say, well, why were you doing that? Or why were you there? Or, saying things where we don't mean to put further harm on that victim survivor, but we just don't know what to say. And so we have a really beautiful course on PAVE's website. It's shatteringthesilence.org. We have PAVE University, and it's a free course about supporting survivors that's free for anyone to take. But what I wish more people knew was that this also impacts people very differently in different communities. So even when I first started PAVE, we worked very closely with the LGBT center on campus, with the all these different communities of color on campus. And for me as a white woman, it was, even though I had a difficult time reporting, there's a lot of additional barriers for reporting for different communities, even for differently abled. We do a lot of work in the deaf and hard of hearing community, in the Amish community. So I think it's important as a movement that we understand that this issue impacts people very differently. And it's very important as a movement that we look at the intersectionality of how different identities, can compound seeking services, and, how difficult it can be for, so many communities who want to keep this more silent for many reasons. So that's one thing I wish that people knew more, was that we have to look at this from a lens of intersectionality.
Thank you. Yes, such a vital part of any social justice work is looking at how this affects different populations differently and meeting them where they are and addressing their needs and supporting them in the way that they should be supported. And I had the honor of attending your beautiful event in Los Angeles. And what I noticed, in addition to featuring male survivors, you featured, queer survivors, survivors of all ages, trans survivors. It was really a beautiful moment where uh, folks of different races and ethnicities and different experiences of sexual violence. It was just a real moment where I saw intersectionality in practice, and it just a beautiful moment, letting you know that. Um, which is a great segue to the next question about the difficulties of being a public survivor. Everyone you had on that stage was a public survivor. Dre Constant, public survivor. You are a very public survivor, and it's incredibly courageous. And I'll just take a detour here to say that I work with people who are public survivors or thinking about being public, and by and large, um, the advice that I offer is that it's probably not going to be worth it. That the public kind of attacks online and the shaming and the blaming and it might not be worth it in terms of people who really want to make a difference, but it comes at such a great personal cost. Now, that's not a one size fits all, but just to bring up the fact that being a public survivor is really difficult. You have provided so much to support to public survivors in high profile trials and non high profile trials over the years. What are you saying to them? And would you make the choice to be a public survivor again if you had that choice to make?
That's a great question. I've never been asked that before. Well, going to your first question, I think it's important for survivors to realize when we talk about shattering the silence, speaking out publicly is certainly not for everyone, and that's why I really encourage art. I know you're a singer and an artist as well, and I think it's important that we look at various ways of shattering the silence, whether it be writing music or poetry or just journaling. We do a lot of trauma informed journal prompts through our healing circles when we partner with Andrea Constant. That's free every single month, by the way, for any survivor who's listening that might want some support. But it is really important for people to realize that there is a lot that can come, even with the potential, you know, even with just putting yourself out there with your name. I mean, we've had survivors receive death threats, and just being so open can come with a lot of just a lot of question marks. You have no idea. And also, in dealing with the media, there is no way for you to know how the media is going to, please. There's no way for you to know how the media is going to deal with your story. And we can't choose that narrative, which is unfortunate. So I do teach survivors on how to kind of use their kind of reframe the question. If in terms of media training, if a journalist is questioning a survivor, to kind of turn that question into what you want to answer. So, like, for example, Chessie Prouts was a young survivor. She was a teenager when she was assaulted at the St. Paul's School, a very prestigious private prep school on the East Coast. And so when she came out publicly on the Today Show, I was there with her. And it's not easy to come forward. I mean, sometimes your address is leaked out publicly. I mean, there is a lot that comes with it. So, if I personally was going to wave my magic wand and go backwards in time, I personally wouldn't change it, only because the gratification that I've received from knowing survivors, helping survivors, being public with my story, knowing that that story is bigger than me. Like, what happens to me is just one small piece. It's like I get so much joy in helping survivors realize that there is a happy, joyful life after trauma. I married my best friend. I've got two amazing kids. We've got two Pomeranian puppies that were just barking in here. Sorry about that. Those kinds of things where, like, joy is possible on the other side. And so I have stopped doing public interviews. It is hard for my family. My mom would probably rather never hear the word PAVE again, just because it brings her back to that day where she felt completely powerless. So I have been asked by a couple of different, Lifetime and these things. But you know what? There's so many other survivor stories that need to be out there. I don't feel like I need to, keep retelling mine. Um, but I wouldn't change it. I think, just knowing when I came forward back in '96, how difficult it was for survivors to speak out. Um, I really would never change it because there was also many men who disclosed to me back in the day, and that was very special to me because it was very hard for men to speak out back in 1996. Um, so yeah,
All right. Well,
that's a great question though. My goodness, I've never been asked that. It's so interesting to think about.
Well, it's the inspiration for that question was actually Nene Leakes from the Real Housewives of Atlanta. She was asked that question at Essence Fest that I attended in New Orleans a few years ago, and her answer was that she wouldn't be a reality star again. And it struck me that that's a weird inspiration, but it struck me that I think there are a lot of public survivors who might want to take it back. But I'm with you. In terms of like the impact, that makes it all worth it at the end of the day for most folks. And your impact has been absolutely tremendous. And I want to talk a little bit more about, we've talked about the institution of law enforcement. I want to talk a little bit more about the institution of media. You talked about how you're not giving interviews now. So I see media as a kind of double-edged sword in terms of addressing sexual violence. I think the campus anti-rape movement, which morphs into the Me Too movement, was very much driven by media coverage. It just wouldn't have happened without the media coverage that it received and the investigative reporting. On the other hand, media is a primary source of rape myths and how we understand and misunderstand rape. I'm wondering what they got right in your case, what they get wrong, what your general analysis is of media coverage of sexual violence.
That's a great question. Years ago, and now I'm aging myself because I think it's back in like 2009 in Washington, D.C., PAVE put on what was called Media in the Movement. We partnered with the National Press Club in D.C., and we brought in journalists and we talked about the importance of the way that these crimes are talked about. So, very nuanced language is extremely important, especially because you are reaching potential jurors, right? Every time a media story is out there. So, for example, when we talk about childhood sexual abuse, for example, it's the language is often very sexualized. So it's like, for example, it's like the act being done to the girl or boy instead of the perpetrator committing the act. It's like this small nuanced language makes a huge difference. Or even like panties for young girls, it's like, no, it's underwear. Like the little things like that do make a difference. And so I think, in my case, it was very hard on my family because he makes all of his victims change clothes and he made me wear this evening gown. When they caught him, he had all these same dresses in all different sizes. So how did he know what dress size I was? Like psychologically, like that's just such a weird thing. And the media really like kind of glommed onto that because it is so bizarre. I didn't think that was an important part of my case, but apparently they did. So that's the interesting part about media. You cannot choose what they as journalists, but I think media is an incredibly important tool to get to a goal. It's never the goal in my mind. I don't think media is ever the goal, but it is a crucial tool to be able to get to the goal. So years ago, we did an event. It was a national protest. There was a rape victim in Nebraska who was given a gag order in court that said that she could not use the words rape, sexual assault nurse examiner. So the judge basically gave her all these words where she was silenced in court when in her criminal trial, she couldn't use all these words in court. Well, why? The judge said it could preface the jury. What really was happening is that he was playing golf with a defense attorney. So we felt that this was a travesty and a huge violation of her First Amendment rights. So in 3 or 4 business days, we had protests from Beverly Hills, California to Albany, New York, where people used scarves to tape over their mouths, holding signs of all the words she couldn't say in court. And it was very powerful. And so that was one of the first times that one of our events like went up to CNN and People Magazine, and it was so cool to see. We gave them all these communities, we gave them media training. I mean, this all happened in such a short period of time. So the media certainly helped to raise awareness about that case. That we really want these cases that we work on to hopefully be used to kind of change the dynamic and change the way that these things are talked about and the way that survivors are treated. Because as you know, the character assassinations that happen in court for survivors of sexual trauma is unlike any other crime. The amount of victim blaming, what survivors deal with when we speak out, is unlike any other crime. So I am hoping that we can shift and really shift the dynamic. And even though I don't talk about my story that much anymore, I do. I'm still a frequent media guest, really trying to elevate other stories that might not be talked about. I think it's really important, especially in communities of color and for LGBT survivors, for us to do what we can to just to raise awareness how this impacts people differently. So yeah, I think we've come a long way, but we still unfortunately have a long way to go. But we're getting there. I hope.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it, but I mean, your analysis of the court and the experience of survivors in the courtroom. Let's talk more about that as kind of this third institution, media, law enforcement, and then the legal system. The system, as you know, as you're pointing out, is really stacked against survivors, and it's wild in these trials. It's not about getting to the bottom of what happened because the alleged perpetrator very rarely takes a stand and is questioned about their actions. It is about assassinating the characters of the victims, survivors, one after another. I just sat through this in the Masterson trial. I will say that sat through this in the Harvey Weinstein trial, where the founder of our organization, Jennifer Siebel Newsom, was called a bimbo by the defense attorney. It just a wild character assassination just for this crime. Can you talk to us about kind of the second violation or perhaps third violation that survivors experience going to law enforcement and then going into a justice system that doesn't serve them justice?
Yes, the injustice system. And I never want to discourage people from reporting. So I truly believe that as a movement, we need to give survivors options. And so that's why I'm really into like restorative justice and options for survivors to seek out what they, what will help them. Because I think a lot of survivors have this idea, this kind of dream that they're going to report to the police, the perpetrator is going to be held accountable. It's going to be an easy thing for, this case to come to trial. Everything's going to be smooth. They report, this person's going to, just and a lot of times survivors don't even want the perpetrator to go to prison. Maybe they just want to be held accountable or maybe be put on a sex offender registration list. That oftentimes unfortunately does not happen. You look at the statistics that you know so often not only do these cases are very underreported, but very few are taken to the DA's office. And I think that also goes into this notion of victim blaming. They know how hard it is to seek a conviction or to receive a conviction. And so they don't even try and seek it because it's just so difficult, which is, it's hard not just on the survivor, but on the entire family, because oftentimes that is very re-victimizing to feel like you're going in there for justice. So Terry Crews said it best. We did an event in Chicago several years ago to celebrate Pave's 20th anniversary. And Terry Crews said, I think survivors oftentimes seek justice. And yes, in a perfect world, survivors would get that justice. But he said, instead of justice, it would be great for survivors, and I'm paraphrasing, but something like to seek like freedom from, these just this all these feelings that come with sexual violence. Again, it's not just a crime against your body, it's a crime against your soul. And this came on the wings of when the Cosby conviction was overturned, and what a devastating blow that had on the survivor community, where people didn't even realize why that happened. And it doesn't mean that he didn't commit the crime. Hopefully everybody gets to see the new film that's not out in the US yet, but the case against Cosby. It's so important for people to realize what happened legality wise in that case. Just because the conviction was overturned doesn't mean that the jury did not find him guilty of these crimes. So there's so many legal nuances. I'm so happy to see that the statute of limitations is changing, and thank you for all your work in that regard. I know that you were such a champion with a lot of other Cosby, survivors and other survivors of, different perpetrators speaking out to try and change the statute of limitations. That's made a huge difference and will continue to. So I do feel like things are starting to change, but again, still have a long way to go.
So, last question, and that is a perfect segue. You have been studying and advocating to prevent sexual violence for decades now. You noted the more than 20 years with PAVE. What do you identify as the root causes of sexual violence? And again, magic wand time, what can we do to address it?
Well, we really truly do live in a rape culture. And I think toxic masculinity is so ingrained and rooted in our culture, and men are suffering from it. And I don't even think that I am a parent of a young boy and a young girl. And I do see that these kind of gender stereotypes do impact just them in general. So I would love for us to start teaching consent much younger. When we were a part of the White House task force years ago, it was the White House task force to protect students from sexual violence. And so they were talking mostly about college campuses, but all the research was showing us the best way to prevent sexual assault on college campuses, in the military, in corporate America is what? Start the conversation younger. And there are age appropriate ways to teach consent, which is teaching respect. And it doesn't even have to be sexualized. Like, can I take a fry from your plate? And not just like grabbing. So, of course it has to deal with body autonomy. But at the end of the day, there's ways that we can teach respect and consent in an age appropriate way, starting very little. My kids know that if I tickle them and they say stop, I stop. I'm not going to force them to give Uncle Joe a hug if they don't want to. I want them to realize that their body is theirs, and there's ways that we can start these conversations very, very young, and to use their words and to feel empowered. And I think also for women, in terms of, we talked about the toxic masculinity gender stereotype, but also for women, we are taught to be a little bit more submissive. Oh my goodness. Oh, thank you. But also, where I saw this man behind me when I was kidnapped. I saw this man, but I did not think, I did think to run for about a half a second. I thought to myself, oh, I didn't want to make a big deal. I didn't want to hurt his feelings. And I tortured myself for years. I'm like, okay, if I saw him behind me, I should have run. I should have gotten away. But yet I didn't allow myself to believe that something like that can happen, because especially as a teenager, you don't want to believe that things like that can happen. And so that was very difficult, because I really did blame myself for years, thinking I could have done something different. I knew that this man was bad news. I purposely didn't listen. But human beings are the only mammals on the planet that don't listen to their God-given gut instinct. So again, magic wand time. I would love for us as humans to trust that God-given gut instinct. If we feel that something's wrong, it is. And for people that are bystanders to step in. We do a lot of bystander intervention training in schools, especially in high schools. And it's an interesting concept, the bystander effect, that the more people that witness an act of violence, the less likely it is that someone's going to intervene. Well, why? They think someone else is going to do it. They think if nobody else is saying or doing anything, then it must be okay. Maybe they're not sure what to do. So really teaching people, and I think just teaching kindness. Like, I think after COVID, there's been so much disconnect. Like, I feel like I just want us to be able, as a society and as humanity, to lift each other up and love each other. And I think that there's just so much fear that really separates us as humans. And I'm really hoping that changes, because it's been tough. I think it's tough.
Yeah. Great points. Your comment about not acting on your instinct reminds me of Gavin DeBecker's classic book, The Gift of Fear, right? And how especially girls and women are taught to override that in order to be pleasing. And also this idea that I've encountered so many times in social justice work, that people assume that if they know about it, somebody else knows about it too and is addressing it. And I would rather that 911 got 10 calls about something rather than no calls about something. Kind of overriding that, oh, someone else is handling it sort of vibe. We have a question from an anonymous attendee. They ask, are there any must-see documentaries or must-read books that you would recommend we watch with our families to spread awareness and dispel rape myths?
Ooh, that's a great question. I would love for everyone to see the case against Cosby, because they do talk a lot about these rape myths and the character assassination that happens within trials. And I thought it was very well done. So I think that should be out in the United States. I just last month spoke at the international theatrical premiere in Toronto, and I think that should be available in the States. Also, Audrey and Daisy, it's a tough watch, but it's about high school sexual assault, and that's on Netflix. And it's a really difficult documentary to watch, but it is important because it does address a lot of the rape myths that are out there. And I think obviously that the founder of your wonderful organization talking about the hunting ground, wonderful documentary that I have, really tried to elevate in my work as I've spoken across the country. I think it's really important piece to talk about sexual assault on campus, which happens all too often. And especially with the red zone, the first 6 months of school, where students are the most at risk. And Invisible War with military sexual trauma, extremely important work. So I would say all of those. And in terms of books, I really enjoyed Jessie Prout's book, I Have the Right To. I think it's a really palatable, it's an important voice in our movement. She was a teenager when this happened. She is very strong. So I think That's a really good book and something that you can read. Have a book club like with your teenagers. And we're trying to produce more content where you can watch these little vignettes with students and have these kind of Q&A, because I think it's important for parents to sit down with their kids. We do a lot of high school work, and before we even get to educate the students, we want to educate the parents, the administration, and the school counselors on what to say or do if someone discloses. Because what we don't want to do is just go in there full force, educate the students, they go and disclose to someone, and then they're not met with the proper response. So, really important work for us to make sure that we're looking at this holistically and educating the parents and the administration and teachers first. And yeah, so I think that's a great piece is just going through and working with your child and using film and books to do that. So, great question. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would say everything on your website as well. And if I can add, Victim Suspect on Netflix now. I mean,
Oh, I haven't seen that yet. That's Nancy's, right? Is that Nancy?
Nancy Schwartzman,
Yes.
and she also
Yes.
did. So she did Roll Red Roll, which was looked at how towns come together to support rapists and cover up sexual violence in the Steubenville case, which was eye-opening, a must-watch. She Victim Suspect, I think, is probably the most shocking to me as someone in this space. Uh, it's a film that exposes a trend of law enforcement wanting to close cases quickly, so they charge women or folks who come forward, not just women, to report sexual violence. They charge them with false reporting, don't investigate the case, and close it. And we're not really sure how common this is, but she was able to, the reporter Ray, who's featured in the documentary, was able to find over 100 cases in the years that she looked at it. And now I'm imagining now that it's, the on the top 10 of Netflix, she's probably got all these people coming forward to report similar experiences. But so many good resources. But go to that paid website, and I would say go to our website for some quick infographics, one pagers. But PAVE has just everything on their website. So definitely visit their website, check it out. There are a number of questions coming in. As a healthcare provider, what can my community do to support survivors in the moment and in the aftermath? Unfortunately, I've witnessed unhelpful and even damaging medical responses.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great question. And thank you for your work, whoever asked that question in the medical field, such important work. So, we have been in touch very closely with Dr. Vince Folletti, who authored the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And I really love his work, and it's nationally renowned for, just it was years ago that he created this. And really, what it shows is that there's a questionnaire that shows these various adverse childhood experiences. It could be trauma, it could be an absentee parent, it could be a parent incarcerated. There's a number of different things that basically create what is an adverse childhood experience. And depending on your ACE score, which is how many of these you've had, what they've noticed is the correlation between that and different health issues later on in life and potential early death. But with education and with early, intervention, those things can hopefully be, reversed. And so I think, creating a safe space for survivors, we have really beautiful survivor care kits. We've launched survivors.org. So PAVE's website is shatteringsilence.org, but we've launched survivors.org with really wonderful resources. So I think giving resources to survivors, we do know that in domestic violence cases, oftentimes when the person tries to leave is when the abuse escalates. And so making sure that if it is a case of dating or domestic violence, that they have access to safety plans. And I think sometimes survivors just want to be asked, did something happen to you? Just in a very open way, because I've worked with a lot of survivors that have gone into different healthcare settings, maybe for an eating disorder, maybe for self harm, for cutting. There's a lot of things that we see. Again, everybody reacts differently to trauma, but we do see a lot of things like self harm and disordered eating, um, and a lot of survivors have told me that they're just waiting to be asked, did something happen? The root of all of these issues is the trauma, but no one's asked. So I've had a lot of survivors tell me, like, I wish that my nurse or my doctor or my healthcare professional, when I was in these, settings, had just asked, like, did something happen to you? And, but then of course having it met with resources, so not just like a yes, let's break for lunch, like, making sure that they know that they are not alone, and even two small things that can make such a difference. Number one, reassuring them that they are not alone and here's some resources, and secondly, reassuring them that it wasn't their fault. Just those two small tangible things that you can say can literally change the trajectory of someone's healing process, because studies show that the first person a survivor tells, sometimes it isn't someone in healthcare, if they react well, that can greatly impact their healing process in a very positive way. So thank you for that great question.
Such a good question and excellent advice, excellent guidance. An anonymous attendee asked, how do you negotiate wanting to teach your daughter and other young women to be safe and aware of very real dangers, while also wanting to encourage them to be themselves and wear what they want to wear?
Yes, I think that's a great question. We have a big thing around Halloween that costumes do not equal consent, because no matter what the person wears, it does not matter. It's not an invitation. So I kind of struggle with that as a mom, of a strong young woman. I want to make sure that she does not live her life in fear, but that she is aware and she does honor that God given gift of fear. So I think for her, it is important as parents that we, don't shield it. It's a balancing act where we don't want to shield them from the dangers of the world, but we don't want them to live their lives in fear. And I think, you know, I just got asked that question actually when I was on we do some work with the Bravo's Real Housewives of Potomac, and there's one of the women who is sending her child off to college, and we had an event talking about this, and it's terrifying as a parent to send your kid off to college, and you just hope you've prepared them enough. But I think letting that child know that you are there for them no matter what. Yes, of course, you want to prepare them as much as you can, but there's only so much that we can do as parents. There's only so much that we can do. Things are going to happen no matter what we do, unfortunately. And that's why I feel like there's a big difference in knowing the difference between risk reduction and prevention. Risk reduction is all those things to make sure that you watch your drink and walk with friends and follow that God given gut instinct. All those things are risk reduction. True prevention is making sure that the perpetrators don't perpetrate these crimes. So, there is a difference between risk reduction and prevention, and there's only so much we can do. But there's also great courses that we have on consent. I would encourage, parents and daughters and sons, everyone to take our course. It's free on shatteringthesilence.org under Pave University on consent, to understand what consent is and how to give and receive consent. That it's an absence of a no does not mean a yes, that it's a freely given, verbal, enthusiastic yes, not the absence of a no. So knowing what consent is, what it means, is extremely important.
Ooh, thank you. Shannon Dumont is recommending a film called I Am Evidence. Another great film, terrible, great film about how rape kits have not been, folks whose rape kits sat for years and just weren't tested and they didn't have investigations. So thank you for that recommendation, Shannon. Another great question from an anonymous attendee. How do well intentioned allies mess up when trying to support survivors? Are there counterintuitive ways we should be showing up to stand by survivors?
It's a great question. A lot of well intentioned allies oftentimes will ask questions not meaning to pry, trying to make conversation, but it actually becomes very uncomfortable for the survivor. So we always teach allies to, let that person, let that victim survivor know that you're there for them, but don't pry and ask for more information that they're willing to give. Also, don't force them to report. Sometimes allies think that they're doing a great service by, like, I don't want to say forcing, but like strongly encouraging them to report to authorities. We really do want to give the choices to survivors, because as we know, as I mentioned before, sexual violence is a crime of power and control, and oftentimes we feel like our power has been taken away. So as an ally, it's really important to make sure that we're giving victims and survivors those choices, but not kind of like forcing them to do something that they might not want to do, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Great, great, great advice for anyone in this space. I'm sure you're taking notes. Um, Andrea has a very specific question for a survivor. Do you have a book, video, or some resources for a young teen who was abused for years, starting at age 6, and they don't want to tell anyone because it's a family friend?
Oh, that's a great question, and that does happen very often when it's somebody that we know and we trust. It's in the family, and there is, and I cannot think of the name right now, but there was a woman who wrote a great book. Um, Hopefully, you can share this afterwards because the name is escaping me at this moment. But yes, uh, that happens a lot. I think it's called "Thriving After Sexual Abuse" or something like that. But when it is a family member or a friend of the family, it does come with a lot of other circumstances. A lot of times, even well meaning family members choose the perpetrator sometimes over the survivor. I've heard that numerous times. And I do think that it's almost like a defense mechanism for the non abusive parent to just say, oh, well, this couldn't have happened under my watch. So, like, they feel the sense of guilt. And so they don't want to, in their mind, like, believe that this happened. So, I also have done a lot of work at juvenile justice centers, and there's been a lot of trauma. These kids that are incarcerated or in these juvenile justice systems, overwhelmingly, I would think everyone that I talk to has been through some type of trauma. And oftentimes it was a stepdad or a babysitter or somebody in their family. And I would say more than half of the times, the mom either didn't believe them or didn't support them or even blamed them for the abuse happening. And that is such a re victimization. So I think it's called Thriving After Sexual Abuse.
Yes,
But do you have
I
another?
found it. Thriving After Sexual Abuse by Denise Bossart.
That's it.
All
Yes,
right.
ma'am. That's it. Yes.
That's the rec. Thank
Yeah,
you.
that's a good one. And then, one other one I wanted to mention, and not for childhood sexual abuse necessarily, but on the record with Drew Dixon, we highlighted Drew Dixon at our last event, and as a woman of color, she really struggled with whether or not to come forward and be on the record with her own face and story, and that's on HBO, and I think that's another good watch.
Oh, right. Of course. Now, of course, a number of other documentaries now flooding in. Amy Ziering and Kirby Dick have made so many good documentaries about rape and sexual violence in different domains. Um, two more questions. Hopefully, we can fit them in because they're so good. An anonymous attendee is asking, given the myriad ways law enforcement can re traumatize victims throughout the process of formally reporting their rape, how can people in positions of authority investigate reported rapes while being careful to not re traumatize the victim?
That's a great question. And we do a lot of law enforcement training and small things, even like body language, to just open up your arms. The tonality is so, you can say one thing and say it with two different tones, and it has completely different feelings and meanings, and it hits survivors very differently. We are going to have a free course on survivors.org shortly with like that can be for law enforcement or for anyone in positions of power. The way that you ask questions, understanding the neurobiology of trauma is extremely important. I'll give kind of just like a quick thing, but survivors oftentimes don't have memories chronologically of what happened. That's because the prefrontal cortex goes offline. And so one thing that we teach is to ask very open-ended questions and to allow survivors to use all their senses, because sometimes we've seen, even with law enforcement for example, there could be the look of a painting on the wall or a sound, something that can corroborate that evidence. It might not be that, you know chronological memory of how things were created, but it's things that were encoded in a victim survivor's memory that could be used. And so allowing them to talk about that abuse using all five senses in a way that you don't keep stopping them. You can ask clarifying questions afterwards, but if you can allow that grace and space for survivors to kind of process that using all five senses, slowing down, explaining everything. I mean, that's the beauty of, trauma informed everything, is just making sure that we understand that you talk to survivors differently, that you can explain things so they don't feel like things are coming out of left field. Same thing for medical professions, when even for gynecological exams, doctors in general, things can be very scary for survivors. Even pregnancy, this foreign thing inside your body. There's a lot of things that, people think of as very joyful that can be very, very activating and triggering for survivors. So just taking time to explain things, watching your tone, and taking some of our free courses. That'll be up shortly. So, and all of our, by the way, social media is at Pave Info. So if you want to plug in and learn more, so it's at Pave Info on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff, TikTok.
So Incredible interview. One last question. And I want to preface this by saying if you're an advocate, you're going to be hearing stories of sexual violence a lot. So, Angela, I hope you speak about maybe how you manage that because I assume you've heard probably thousands of stories. But Stephanie asks, as a survivor, I asked when you think we might be ready to be an advocate. I assisted in recalling Judge Aaron Persky in the Chanel Miller case. That's a Stanford rape case. But as I go through my own healing, I'm not sure when I'd be ready to support others. When did you know?
I think self care and boundaries, those two things are very, very important. Number one, you can't pour from an empty cup. So self care is extremely important. I'm a big proponent of that. And even, and that can look different for different people, but, it's interesting. And I have actually a talk on self care for advocates because when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right, it's like people talk about bubble baths and self care, but if you're not drinking enough water and sleeping enough, there is not enough bubble baths that are going to help you overcome. I had very low blood pressure to the point it was like 80 over 40, and I was in urgent care, and it was because I wasn't sleeping enough and I wasn't drinking enough water. So it's like those you need to really look at what you can do to take care of yourself and boundary work. We do a lot of boundary work workshops with our chapters and affiliates because oftentimes as survivors we do have huge hearts, we're extremely empathetic, we want to change the world, but we also know that survivors sometimes can see that light, and it's not a bad thing, but it's important for us to make sure we're not hindering someone's healing process because we're not trauma therapists, advocates. Knowing kind of our role is really important, that we can be an advocate, but we also don't want to hinder somebody's healing process if they need something like EMDR or some really, with a practice therapist, trauma informed therapist, trauma, with the specialist, you don't want to be hindering someone's healing process. So I think those two things are really important: self care and boundary work, and knowing that it's okay to take a step back and then get back into it later. Like if you go into the world of advocacy and you find yourself feeling activated, we are trying to get away from the word triggered actually. So you kind of maybe you feel activated, it is perfectly normal to just take some steps back and fill your cup and walk away and come back when you're ready. And I think being really mindful of where you are in your body, doing body scans. How are you feeling? For me, if I don't do my yoga practice and have my little meditation and yoga in the morning, I feel completely different throughout the day. So really prioritizing yourself and your own self care and creating different habits. It really helped me to get into a habit of like before I, jump up and deal with the day and the kids and all that, like really taking just 20 minutes for yourself can make such a difference. So prioritizing your self-care, because I think for us as survivors and we want to change the world, but sometimes it's at the detriment of our own well-being. So just reminding ourselves that it is not only okay, it is necessary for us to take care of ourselves.
Thank you. Folks, that is the brilliant Angela Rose. I could listen to you talk for hours. That was incredible guidance and wisdom. Thank you for sharing your expertise and just wish you the best in all of this important work. Thank you, Angela.
Thank you. And thank you for all that you do. I'm so grateful to be here with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. See y'all soon. Take care, Godspeed on all of your activism and self care and boundaries. That's what I'm taking away. Have a great day, y'all.